Good evening, everyone. And once again, thank you very much for joining us on Academic Dialogue in Hargeisa Africa 1440 webinar series, where tonight we are going to have our 7th episode, which is going to be covering one of the most significant social aspects of our life, since our episode tonight is about democratization and the impact of COVID on that process. And in this process, we are trying to discuss and find an answer, or at least understand with each other questions like election postponement has been a decision. There has been a declaration of state of emergency on almost in every places in the continent. And we have seen a change in the dynamics of the executive power. So these are gonna be the points of discussion for tonight. For this, we couldn't have any better panel than the one that we have lined up today with regional and global scholars, where we have our 4 distinguished scholars like Professor Michael Wildemariam and Professor Nick Chisman as a main speaker, and Philomeno Apiko and Dr. Rashid Abdi as a respondent. It is difficult to put all together the accomplishment of these all significant scholars, so I'll try to say few of the achievement they have, starting with our main speaker. Professor Michael Wildemariam is a professor of international relations at Boston University's Pratt School of Global Studies. He is a newly appointed director of Boston's University African Studies Center. He previously has worked as a researcher specialist with several institutions, and his teaching and research interests are in Africa security studies, with a particular focus on armed conflict in the Horn of Africa. And his scholarly work actually has been published in a lot of journals, which include the Journal of Nationalism and Ethnic Politics, Terrorism and Political Violence, Journal of Strategic Studies, and the Journal of Eastern African Studies. His book, actually, the insurgent fragmentation in the Horn of Africa, Rebellion and its discontentment, is one of the key publications regarding the region that was published in 2018. So it's a blessing to have you, Professor, with us tonight. The second main speaker for the night is Professor Nick Chisman, who is a professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham. He mainly works on democracy, election, development, and like Professor Michael, he has published a lot of research on African nations, including Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Zimbabwe. And Professor is also author and also editor of 10 books, which include Democracy in Africa, which was published in 2015, Institutions and Democracy in Africa, How to Rig an Election, and Coalitional Presidentialism in Comparative Perspective, which was published in 2018, are among his publication. He has been awarded the Johnny Labundiski Award for his outstanding contribution, and he is known for his frequently comments on African and global events, whose analysis has been covered by many international institutions. So these two are gonna be our main speakers for the night. As a respondent for the night, we have Philomeno Apiko and Dr. Rashid Abdi. Philomeno is a policy officer in the African Institution and Regional Dynamics Program at the European Center for Development Policy Management, which is based in Netherlands. In this institution, she has worked on research focusing on African institutions, including on Africa Union institutional reform process and the financing agenda, governance under the African governance architecture, the African continental free trade area, and African regional response to COVID-19, which is a very important component of our discussion today. Her other areas of research work and interest also include international justice, election, and state-society relationships. So it's a blessing again to have you. Our other respondent is gonna be the Dr. Rashid Abdi, who is a Horn of Africa analyst, formerly Horn of Africa project director at the Crisis Group. He also has served as a senior editor with BBC and the Nation Media Group. Dr. Rashid has informed a lot of policy decisions in the Horn of Africa and beyond. So these are going to be the 4 distinguished panelists that we have, who are going to have the discussion through the moderation of Salma Sheikh Mohammed, who is the chief editor and the founder of the Somaliland Review magazine, which is a quarterly magazine published in Somaliland, here in Hargeisa, Somaliland. She has graduated in international politics and sociology from UK. She has extensive service as a activism and community work here in Somaliland, focusing on women and youth empowerment. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Those of you who are following us on Facebook, and all of you who have registered for the webinar on the Zoom, I would say welcome and thank you very much. And I'll pass it to you, Salma, to do your lovely moderation.
Thank you very much, Terset. That was a very pleasant introduction to everybody. I am here moderating for this particular session, and I would like to welcome you all, and hopefully we will be able to produce here today a very fruitful debate or discussion on the issue at hand. Like Terset said, we have 10 sessions, 10 minutes presentation from each professor that we have here today. And I would love to start with Professor Nick Chisman, please, with your presentation on the issue we're discussing here today.
Great, thanks everyone. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here, and hope everyone can hear me fine. Do let me know in the chat if you can't. Now, my main job, I think, today is basically to set the scene. So I'm going to try and give a kind of general sense of what we might be looking at over the entire continent, and then we're going to narrow down a bit after that to look more specifically at the Horn. So my job is to set the scene. And I suppose if we wanted to put it in a kind of pithy way, we might say that COVID-19 and the pandemic has kind of been a triple whammy. It's been a triple whammy for democracy and for civil liberties in many countries, because we've seen three separate processes happening at the same time. The first has already been mentioned, and that is that we've basically seen a kind of greater justification for governments using restrictions on civil liberties, the introduction of a state of emergency, greater clamping down on the media, and so on. The second is that, of course, international actors and regional actors who might generally be expected to speak out in favor of civil liberties or in favor of democracy are A, distracted because of the need to fight COVID-19, but also B, they're not on the ground. For example, people like election observers, international media, etc., are finding it very difficult because of travel restrictions. At the same time, a third trend is, in a sense, undermining the ability of many civil society groups to respond. As we know, although social media is penetrating the continent in exciting ways, and we see high levels of penetration in many countries, it's still true that for many civil society groups, one of the most effective mechanisms is to take people onto the streets, to organize protests, to go door to door, to rally people in that way. And of course, one of the things that you can't do during COVID-19 is that kind of mass action. So on the one hand, we see emboldened autocrats. On the other hand, we see a constrained international community. And on the other hand, again, we then see civil society actors struggling to be able to respond to that. And that's the kind of triple whammy that makes this a really interesting and important question for us to think about. Now, it's very important to say, of course, that this is not happening in every country. Africa has a great variety of systems. We have some genuinely democratic states that are not taking advantage of the pandemic in this way. And we see more authoritarian states that are clearly taking advantage of the pandemic in this way. So it's important not to have a one-size-fits-all approach. But one thing I do want us to focus on is that many of the countries that are scheduled to hold elections in the next year are on the more authoritarian side of the spectrum. So if we look at the electoral timetable to come, Tanzania, I think we've got Ghana, Chad, Ethiopia, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Niger, Somalia, Uganda are the ones who come out. Recently, of course, we've seen Burundi and Malawi. Of the countries that I just read out, many of those countries have significant challenges when it comes to elections, either in terms of elections being controversial or accusations that elections are manipulated and they basically used to keep authoritarian regimes in power. So of the countries that are coming up with elections, the risk of the manipulation of the pandemic in those processes seems to be particularly high. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is just talk us through how I think some of my previous work, for example, the book How to Rig an Election that was mentioned at the beginning, can help us to see the ways in which leaders might try and manipulate the pandemic should they decide to do so. And I think one of the things that's really important is that sometimes the way this has been covered in the media has tended towards a rather simplistic perception. And that perception has been that leaders will simply postpone elections using COVID-19 as the device to do that. And there's obviously a clear advantage in doing that for leaders, which is that they can lengthen their time in office and stay in office for longer by postponing elections down a year or two until the pandemic is over. But actually, I think we're going to see a much more sophisticated and complex situation where some leaders might take that strategy and some leaders might take another strategy. So to set things up for the later discussion, I want to set three different kinds of ways of playing kind of pandemic manipulation in elections down. The first is that actually some leaders might not decide to postpone elections at all. They might decide to bury bad news. Right? They might decide that if they're going to have a bad quality election and they know it's going to be the kind of election that's going to draw criticism, why not hold it during a pandemic when international attention is elsewhere, international media can't come, there will not be international election observers, and therefore it's easier to get away with a bad process. And to some extent, of course, that's what we saw in Burundi. In Burundi, the government went ahead with an election. The election campaign itself had mass rallies. It looked like a traditional election campaign in that country, but there were no election observers because fairly close to the process, the government said that the observers would have to quarantine. The period of quarantine would have meant that the observers wouldn't have been out of quarantine by the time the election was actually being held, and so the observers didn't travel. And so actually what was quite a problematic process with systemic use of violence actually went without significant international condemnation. So the first option is very bad news. Use the pandemic as an opportunity to hold a poor quality election and get away with it because you know it's going to be easier to do so now than later down the line. The second is to kind of play clever pandemic politics, not just to hold the election when you're intending to during COVID, but to use COVID-19 as an excuse to change the rules of the game. And this seems to be what's happened with like Uganda, where President Museveni is now, having previously looked like he might go to postpone, saying that the elections will be held, but they will be digital or scientific elections. And what that seems to imply is that the traditional form of rallies will actually be prohibited. Opposition parties will not be allowed to go knocking door to door, but everyone will be expected to use digital processes. Now, that might normally be expected to advantage, say, the opposition. Figures like Bobby Wine, who we recently had on my show, The Resistance Bureau, who have vast numbers of followers on social media, might be seen to be more effective over that mechanism than President Museveni. But in a bid to respond to the COVID crisis, President Museveni has also said that he's going to provide hundreds of thousands of TVs and radios to villages across Uganda. And I think one of the things that we can perhaps suspect is that one of the things that will be used with those TVs and those radios is actually to ensure that Museveni's message gets into the houses of ordinary Ugandans, giving him an inbuilt advantage in the digital or scientific process. So leaders can play pandemic politics, manipulating the restrictions that are required around COVID-19 to give themselves an advantage they might not always have had. And then, of course, there is that option of postponing the elections. This is what we might think of as kind of democracy deferred. We might see leaders simply deciding that the election is too risky, or of course, that there's genuinely a health crisis and a very good health reason to postpone the elections. And we should keep in mind that elections have been legitimately postponed in many countries. But that's where we might see countries like Chad and Ethiopia, which have postponed the elections. And particularly, for example, in the Ethiopian case, it does seem to me that one of the reasons for postponing them was that they weren't really in a position to be able to hold good quality, stable elections on the date that they were scheduled in the first place. So three very different strategies that leaders might use: the bury the bad news strategy, the pandemic politics, and then the democracy deferred. I think one of the interesting questions that would be good to sort of follow up on in the discussion as we go, is the question of which of these strategies will different leaders pick. And there's obviously a few different things that are going to shape that choice. Leaders who are pretty sure that they're going to win, or that they can win with a certain degree of manipulation, are likely to choose the kind of bury the bad news or the pandemic politics options, because these are options that allow you to have a fairly poor quality election and get away with it. And if you think you can win, it makes sense to do that. The leaders that are really going to choose to postpone elections are probably going to be those that aren't completely sure that they're going to be able to win, that are coming up term limits and are worried about having to stand because of term limits. And also, of course, at the same time, those leaders who might be worried about the impact of it on something like political stability. So I think one of the things that we really need to tease out, and hopefully we can do this in the rest of the discussion, is what kind of position are the leaders in the countries that we've talked about that are going to be holding elections? How confident are they that they're going to win? And given that, what can we expect them to do in terms of the way that they respond to the pandemic and holding elections in the context of the pandemic? And with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nick Chisman. You have mentioned a number of sound points there, and we will have a presentation from Professor Michael. But before that, I would love to hear from Wilhelmina to respond to the points that the professor just has spoke about.
Thank you so much, Salma, and thank you, Professor Nick, for the insightful presentation. Very, very good points raised, especially also on my own country. So I will just keep it brief as well to allow for more discussion later. So you did mention, I will start from your 3 strategies: to postpone, clever pandemic politics, and postponing the elections. So for me, when I was listening to your presentation, of course, we all know that conducting elections during a pandemic is not straightforward, because you know how it's been happening in the past has been more in voting systems where people actually appear personally. And you mentioned something that was very, very, very interesting when you came to Uganda towards the digital campaigning. And for me, then I had already thought about, could the pandemic provide opportunities for new ways of voting? So during state of emergency, door-to-door campaigning or public rallies might not be possible due to the lockdown limitations. So how far is it possible to compensate for this by public or private media and the use of internet and social media? And it's very interesting that you mentioned Bobby Wine and his reach to the masses. But again, when looking at a country like Uganda, you have to look at the practicalities. Number one, social media tax is still in place. So how logical can you expect the younger population who are his voters, who right now, because of the lockdown, are not working, be able to actually every day pay this small amount that may be to somebody maybe in the EU, but to Ugandan, it's a lot of money. Then speak about the poor internet and electricity connectivities and how people in the rural areas will be accessed. You mentioned the televisions and radios being passed out, but as we know, of course, there's propaganda that can go into that, but also it disadvantages new contestants who are unknown in the country, because then they might not be easily recognizable on, for example, the radio or television. And then also you mentioned something about Ethiopia and the postponing of elections. And for me, as a legal person, I already thought about from a legal perspective, the election postponement during the pandemic could also raise the question of how do we manage the situation in the interim period. For example, the end of one constitutional term mandate and the beginning of a new one. And I think in Ethiopia, this has been flagged as an issue, considering that the elections were originally supposed to be in August, but have now been postponed until the pandemic is over, however long that takes. And similarly, if you look at the Central African Republic, this issue was also adjudicated by the Constitutional Court, addressing the issue of the constitutional vacuum or power vacuum, as some people have referred to it. Of course, you did mention the point of somebody could choose to just have bad elections because anyways, you're going to win. And for me, this then just made me think about what are some of the regional and continental legal frameworks in place to also allow some of these bad elections. You know, a number of African countries are signatories to, for example, the African Charter and also the African Charter on Democracy, Governance and Elections, which set out a sort of framework of how elections should be governed in the country. And the AU itself, African Union, has been adamant against unconstitutional use of government and takeover of power, illegally. But it still lacks a clear position on what is termed constitutional coups, whereby presidents are extending their term mandates, as seen in the case of Burundi and also in Uganda with the age limit. So for me, in this sense, COVID is like merely an extension of an existing problem. Of course, there are risks that the incumbents could resort to this measure. And I feel that this should inspire the African Union and the regional communities to rework their approach to democratic practices in emergency situations, what is acceptable and what is not, even when it comes to elections. What should you be considering acceptable elections during an emergency situation? And of course, how to manage issues of state sovereignty. Those were some of my first thoughts towards our election postponement. And of course, I have some more thoughts also on the state of emergency, because as we know, this is allowed in some constitutions, but of course, it has to be proportionate, it has to be temporary, it has to be necessary to the situation. But you find that there's a misuse of state of emergency powers in some countries through the securitization of responses versus treating the COVID-19 pandemic as a health issue, and what are the implications for human rights, you know? And then also speak about the issue of trust between government and citizens. For me, I feel like transparency and accountability, even during this time, should be maintained. A self-motivated and well-informed population is usually far more powerful and effective than a politicized and uninformed population. So people need to trust the authorities, to also trust social media, trust the mainstream media, trust science and new technologies that are being used, you know, during the election process. And of course, my last point, because I have to mention this, as a legal person, I have to go back to the oversight during these emergency measures. Who actually is in place to monitor what executive powers are doing? Because in most of our countries, you find that we have limited judicial and parliamentary oversight over state of emergency powers, which is also in the lockdown is being made difficult, because you might find that the judiciary in some countries, the courts are closed, the ombudsman's office might also be closed, human rights institutions as well. So it makes it difficult to check the executive power during the lockdown, as well as the civil society and independent media also are being constrained by these lockdown measures to actually monitor effectively. Those are some of my thoughts, and I'm open to discussion again.
Philomena, I will bring you in again soon, but I would like to hear from Professor Michael and his presentation. But before that, I want to mention it's a real dilemma for Africa. In fact, you know, if leaders postpone the elections, it's a question of like them getting benefits from that. And if they held the elections, then it might become irresponsible of them to actually let their people go out and crowd themselves in election posts. Or the fact that the international observers might not attend or might not be able to attend or not allowed to attend might also raise the question of transparency. But it looks like it's never good. It's never a good or a positive criticism coming out of it. Is always an issue to criticize. On that note, I would love to hear from Professor Michael on this issue we are talking about today. Professor Michael?
Great. So let me begin by thanking the Hargeisa Cultural Center for the invitation to be here. It's good to see old friends. I think Professor Chisman, Philomena had a really excellent discussion. As Professor Chisman suggested, I'm going to focus a little bit more on democratization processes in the Horn and how COVID-19 is impacting the situation. Let me begin by saying something about the sort of context, or how I see the context for democratic politics in the Horn. I think it's fair to say most would agree that the region is in the midst of the most significant political transformation it has seen since the end of the Cold War. I don't think that's a controversial statement. You know, that was a moment, of course, where between 1989 and 1991, we had 3 governments that were toppled, 2 new states that were created, one a de facto state, the other a de jure. So it was a time of enormous change. So, you know, we're at a moment now that is not quite like the end of the Cold War, but the most change we've seen, I think, since then. The current transformation, of course, is headlined by the political liberalization we've seen in both Ethiopia and Sudan, and I will come back to those 2 cases at the end. And those transformations, or that political liberalization, has in turn led to some pretty significant shifts in regional relations. I think if those transitions are successful, and I've written about this before, that's a big if, of course, given the current climate, I think there will be some contagion in neighboring countries that have thus far been resistant to reform and change. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that what's happening in the Horn today with respect to democratic politics is in some ways quite different from what's going on what's gone in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. I think much of the continent was part of what was called, or what's been called, the quote unquote third wave of democratization. And so at the end of the Cold War, most sub-Saharan African countries saw an introduction of reasonably competitive multi-party politics. The Horn, beyond Somaliland, which is an exception in the region in so many ways, missed that boat entirely at the end of the Cold War. And so as a result, for the better part of 3 decades, I think the face of power in the region has been fundamentally autocratic. Governments in the region have differed on a range of issues. They feuded with one another, but I think they have shared, historically at least, a common authoritarian worldview. The logic of force really carried the day. And I think what that means at the present moment is that while much of the continent is dealing with problems of democratic consolidation or democratic backsliding, the Horn really is at a much more basic level of democratic development. We are talking about democratic institution building from the ground floor in most countries. And that means things are necessarily more fragile. It's generally easier to keep a house standing than it is to try and build one from the ground up. And again, that is the situation the Horn faces relative to the rest of the continent at this juncture. The other contextual point I would make here is that the region is in a phase of enormous long-term consequence. Moments of political transition are periods where history is compressed and events of great significance happen in a relatively short period of time. And so I think a failure to secure democratic politics in the 2 sort of big countries in the region where we're seeing changes, Ethiopia and Sudan, at this critical juncture is going to be a missed opportunity this region will be dealing with for at least another generation or 2. And I think back to the transitions of the early 1990s, so they're really instructive in this regard. Beyond, again, the case of Somaliland, the region really missed an opportunity to forge a democratic politics. In Ethiopia, in Eritrea, in Djibouti, Sudan, although Djibouti didn't really go through a leadership transition. And the result of failures in that short period, the region got 3 decades of authoritarian politics, with some of the benefits, of course, but some of its much more significant costs, in my view. Okay, so that's the context. Let me turn to the issue of COVID-19. So I'm in the midst of writing a report co-authored with 2 colleagues who some of you may know, Goitum Gebrelul and Jostin Haug. And that looks at the political and economic impacts of the pandemic in the Horn. And our bottom line conclusion is not a particularly surprising one. That is that COVID-19 has generally not been helpful to the cause of democratization in the region. In large part, I mean, there are many effects, some direct, some indirect. But I think the biggest issue is that the pandemic has exacerbated political conflicts within countries undergoing transition, such that the kind of negotiated settlements necessary for a genuine democratic politics are becoming increasingly unlikely or untenable. And I think the most obvious case of that right now, the most clear-cut case of that, I think, is Ethiopia at the current juncture. I think the fundamentals, and again, this is my own view, I think the fundamentals of the Ethiopian transition have been looking progressively worse for some time. But I think the issue of election postponement has really been an inflection point that has made things much more difficult. So let me talk through that issue. So the government's critics have for some time been concerned, and they vocalized this, that the ruling party would basically use a wide variety of what we call incumbency advantages to tilt the electoral playing field in its favor. So control over media, control over public resources, appointments, control of foreign relations, sort of a range of incumbency advantages to basically sort of manipulate the field of play in the elections to their long-term advantage. And of course, a legacy of 28 years of EPRDF rule is that its offspring, what's now known as the Prosperity Party, the PP, controls nearly all levers of the state in a context in which there has traditionally been very little distinction between the affairs of the party and the affairs of the state, right? So this fear, this concern on the part of some of the government's critics, its opponents, and that's a large collection of very disparate interests. We're not talking about one coherent thing. I think have been enhanced by the fact that the pandemic made, for a time at least, the mobilization of the opposition supporters quite difficult. And this is a point that Nick, I think, mentioned in his presentation, that because of COVID-related restrictions, for a while there was a pause, I think, on the ability or the willingness of opposition networks to actually mobilize their supporters. And that was a key form of leverage they had vis-a-vis the government. So naturally, when the election was postponed, or when that was taken under consideration, the government's critics, the opposition, were quite wary. I think if we look at the range of opinion across this disparate group of opposition forces, you would see that most probably endorsed the postponement. There's some key exceptions, but I think they all wanted to ensure that this extension was not used to further enhance the ruling party's hand vis-a-vis the electoral process. And because this postponement created a constitutional conundrum, that is, the government would have been unconstitutional beyond October of this year, and there was no mechanism to deal with that. The opposition, or constitutional mechanism to deal with that, the opposition basically hoped to use the process of resolving this conundrum as a way to guarantee a more even playing field or more advantageous electoral playing field, right? Now, at the most extreme end, as this debate was playing out, what critics of the government demanded was basically to dissolve the incumbent government or create a transitional administration. But I don't think that was ever really a realistic option and didn't have a critical mass of public support. Others suggested some sort of constitutional amendment, but that was time-consuming and quite difficult. What eventually was opted for in the Ethiopian context as a mechanism of postponing the elections and extending the government's life was something called constitutional interpretation by the House of Federation, Ethiopia's House of Federation, and the Council of Constitutional Inquiry. So they basically took it upon themselves to interpret the Constitution and then extend the life of the government. But the hope here, amongst many legal analysts at the time, was that there would be a process of dialogue and consensus building between the ruling party and its opponents about how this extension would work and how it would be structured practically and legally. And this was essential because remember, as a legacy of 28 years of authoritarian rule, the opposition has no real presence in the institutions of government, has no presence in parliament, the House of Federation, or the Council of Constitutional Inquiry. Now, the problem was at this juncture, this latter piece, this idea or this mechanism of consultation and dialogue between the government and the opposition didn't really happen in any real sense. And essentially a government apparatus controlled by the ruling party, again, I don't think this is a controversial opinion, I think it's pretty clear, basically extended its mandate in a way that kind of gave it a blank slate. And what do I mean by that? First of all, if you look at the extension, the postponement of the election, the extension of the government's mandate, the ruling party can effectively decide when the next election is held. I mean, it's not framed in that way, but if you read the letter of this extension, that's basically what's in play here. The government's powers within the extension period are not limited in any real way. And there's no actual requirement that the ruling party consult its opponents or the public on consequential matters during the extension period. These were some of the key asks or requests of some of the government's critics about how this election postponement would actually proceed and how the government's life would be extended. So, we're in a situation now where the government's critics, rightly or wrongly, there are different views on this, feel as if they've kind of been railroaded by this process. And that has in turn created a couple of dangerous dynamics. Let me mention two in particular. So of course we have the case of Tigray Regional State and its ruling party, the TPLF, which has said in no uncertain terms that they will hold their own elections, that the government beyond October will be unconstitutional and they therefore have a right and a mandate to conduct their own elections. That's been contested. Some would say that's not actually legal. Whether it's legal or not, that puts them at loggerheads and at at risk of serious conflict with the federal government of Ethiopia, which has opposed this idea. And then what we've also seen is that the other mainline opposition parties, particularly some of the sort of ethno-nationalist, pro-federalist variety, know if that's exactly the way to describe them. But they're in a situation where, again, rightly or wrongly, they feel as if they must sort of mobilize their supporters and send them to the streets to sort of protect their equities in the transition. Because I think that's really the only card that they have left to them, right? They have no institutional levers to really use. And that, of course, is quite dangerous, right? Because that lends itself to the kind of violence we saw these past 2 weeks in Ethiopia. I mean, the violence we've seen over the last 2 weeks is incredibly complicated. But I think, you know, the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa, that was really just a trigger or a spark that set off this violence. I mean, there are deeper causes that have to do with the trajectory of the transition. I think that have to be looked at very, very closely. The last thing I'll say about Ethiopia, and this is really sort of my own opinion, I think that any resort to sort of military force or coercive means to resolve escalating tensions between the ruling party and its key opponents will probably permanently derail Ethiopia's democratic transition. I think it's only through a balance of the major political forces in the country and some sort of settlement between them that genuine multi-party democracy is going to take hold. I mean, to expect one political faction or alliance of factions to advance a democratic agenda in the absence of some kind of check from alternative political forces is not really realistic and defies sort of what we know about how democracies have been built historically, right? Okay, so that's Ethiopia. There's a lot more one could say about Ethiopia. Let me say something about Sudan. I mean, COVID has not had the same kind of explosive political impact, I think, in Sudan that it has necessarily in Ethiopia. Sudan, of course, is not supposed to have elections until 2022, but that, you know, that may even be, but there is some risk of postponement given that because the transition process is supposed to meet certain benchmarks and it's quite delayed overall. But the situation is really fragile. There's significant political competition between the security apparatus and what you could call the civilian pro-democracy movement. There's competition between forces within these two political camps. Then, of course, you have political jockeying that involves forces from the Sudanese periphery, what we might call the periphery, Darfur, South Kordofan, Blue Nile, East Sudan as well. And then, of course, we have remnants of the old ruling party, the NCP and the Islamists. So it's all a very messy situation. I think COVID has at certain junctures created conflict between the civilians and the security apparatus. So in April of this year, the military governor of Khartoum refused to implement one of the civilian prime minister's orders on COVID, basically requested the closure of mosques for a period of time. This military governor was then fired by the prime minister. He refused to step down. The prime minister, Abdullah Hamdok, eventually won that political battle, right? Probably bodes well for the overall trajectory of the transition. In May of this year, some of the generals on the Sovereign Council, which is like the executive, there's some ambiguity here, but basically the executive arm of the transitional government, tried to engineer the ouster of the Minister of Health for his performance in terms of addressing the COVID-19 crisis. And this was viewed as an overstep of the mandate of the generals. And the civilians won that battle as well, right? So that I think might consider that to be a positive development. I think what we've also seen is that the rapid support forces, which are part of the security apparatus, have used some of the resources at their disposal to boost their visibility through COVID-related relief. And some have argued that might undermine the credibility of the civilian government. So that's also been a concern. But with all of these sort of COVID-related problems and others, I mean, Sudan faces a really dire economic situation. The transition is on track. I mean, delayed, but definitely on track. And I see two major differences with Ethiopia that I want to flag that I think are important. First, I think the government that is presiding over the transition is itself a transitional or caretaker administration, which includes by design many of the country's major political stakeholders, and increasingly so. So some of the political forces on the Sudanese periphery will soon be brought into the transitional government. And many of the key figures within the transitional government, whether it's Hamdok, General Burhan, Hemedti, are all barred legally from actually running in the next election. So the Sudanese transition has something akin to a referee. You can't say that the transitional administration is neutral, but it's akin to a sort of referee. And I think that has introduced its own kind of stability or order to the transition that is quite useful. And the second is that the international community is heavily involved and engaged in Sudan in ways that are sometimes counterproductive, but I think are enhancing the democratization process overall. The international community, of course, is heavily involved in Ethiopia behind the scenes, but they're not particularly forceful or purposeful, I think, about their engagement, which is interesting given how important Ethiopia is to overall regional stability. So I do see some notable differences between Ethiopia and Sudan overall in terms of the trajectory of the democratization process, but both, I would say, very concerning cases. So I think I've spoken enough, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was very good explanation in terms of the Rashid Abdi, who should be responding to Professor Michael's comments here. Rashid?
Thank you very much. Let me first of all express my thanks to Hargeisa Cultural Center for inviting me to this meeting. My role here seems to be a bit superfluous because most of, I think, the things that I wanted to say have been said by my colleagues. Just let me, I think, highlight a few things. One, of course, is that just as Professor Mike has indicated, the Horn is in the midst of multiple transitions of different kinds, all of them contested, and we do not know where these transitions eventually will end, or we do not know the trajectory of these transitions. Then on top of that, I think you have a region that has been highly unstable throughout recent years. Massive dislocation of civilians, millions of them. The Horn has some of the highest displacement figures of anywhere in the world. Then you also have resurging ethno-nationalist sentiments, which is beginning, I think, to manifest itself in very violent ways in places like Ethiopia. Then you also have, I think, serious economic challenges with a lot of economies in serious crisis, in particular Sudan and Ethiopia. Now, COVID, I think, comes, when you add COVID to this mix, then you can see, I think, the bigger dilemma and the challenges which the region faces. Let me also say that up to now, we do not know how this disease is progressing and where and how the picture will look like in the coming months. In many of the states, we are very far away from the peak, but the numbers are actually beginning to worry the people, especially in Kenya, but also in Somalia as well as in Ethiopia. Kenya has been very good at being very open about the figures. Ethiopia less so, but still, I think the picture is definitely worrying. It is true that many of these countries have taken remarkable, steps to contain the disease, lockdowns and serious containment, I think, strategies are in place. The problem again is that there is also a resource squeeze, and this is definitely, I think, something that will cause a lot of problem in the coming months. We are beginning to see budgets actually being slashed, money being diverted to the COVID, pandemic containment. But ultimately, I think when you put all these factors together, you can see why the Horn is going to be in serious trouble in the coming months. Ethiopia's situation definitely is very difficult. The transition has been unstable for a while, but now has taken, I think, a turn for the worse. Hopefully, in the coming weeks, the Prime Minister may perhaps step back from the brink and try to build a more coherent strategy to, first of all, contain the ethnic tensions, but also, I think, to try to formulate a roadmap and a way out of the impasse in Ethiopia politically. Somalia has also had a similar problem in terms of election in the last 1 year. The plan was to hold a one person, one vote, and this was put to parliament, and a law was passed. But clearly, it was extremely difficult for such an ambitious, one person, one vote to ever take place in a country like Somalia, where the insurgency holds significant chunks of territory, where insecurity is rife, also where some of the technical requirements for the one person, one vote have not actually been fulfilled. Things like voter registration, things like population census, demarcation of constituencies. All these issues have not been done, and so it was clear that the one person, one vote, was an ambition, probably laudable, but much premature in the sense that the country was not very prepared. And these caused significant tensions within the country. We saw a split between the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states. We also saw the opposition actually coming out very strongly against this one person, one vote. In the last 1 week, there has been significant progress, and probably much more positive steps are being taken. The federal members states have all come together and met and decided that there has to be an alternative model that will probably end the current mandate of the government. So discussions, I think, are now underway seriously to begin to ask what is the alternative model that all Somali stakeholders can agree upon. We do not know how the ultimate model will look like. It could be, just a fudge or some kind of a hybrid model in which some areas which are stable and secure will have some form of universal suffrage, and areas where that is not possible, you will have the selection process. So that, I think, is the discussion which is underway, and that is all positive. But going back, I think, to the point which both Mike and Professor Chisman have alluded to, which is how governments are going to respond in this climate. I think there is no doubt that COVID has strengthened the authoritarian instincts of many governments. We have seen in the first few weeks, actually, a very heavy-handed crackdown on people and civilians, and actually deaths. We have also, seen massive displacement in some places caused by these, governments trying to move people from certain districts, especially in Nairobi. One area which I think, I think I would like to highlight and hasn't been mentioned is the impact on electoral machinery. The election processes in the Horn have always been, I think, very poor preparations and all that. And we see that actually very clearly in the case of Somalia, where the National Electoral Commission had over a 2-year period to actually plan some kind of a credible poll, and got substantial amounts of money to do that, a lot of donor funding as well. But the chairman of the National Electoral Commission came before Parliament some 2 weeks ago and basically admitted that it is unfeasible to hold the elections anytime this year. Somalia is not alone in this. This is not an aberration. This is the pattern I think you see in many countries, even in Kenya, which has a much more bigger economy, much more experience in this kind of electoral politics. But machineries in these places are always the biggest problem. And I think with now resources being diverted away from many critical areas of government to COVID containment, my fear is that 2 years down the line we will be faced with a situation where the electoral commissions in these parts of the world will be coming up and saying we are not adequately prepared, or we are not adequately resourced, and so we need more time, we need more resources. And so that is my biggest fear. That's one of the biggest impacts I think would be the strain it is putting on electoral machineries. There is also another, I think, important factor which I want to highlight, which is the electoral politics in the Horn is always contested. Politics is also contested, but also this region has become much more important geopolitically. So we are also living in an age where middle powers and big powers are all, I think, competing for influence in the Horn. And I think some of them are actually putting a lot of money and resources into these political systems, largely through patronage systems and patronage networks. Now, COVID has definitely substantially reduced the amount of money that is sloshing around the political economy, and that is quite significant. In places like Somalia, for example, we know that money ultimately is the one that swings the votes much more, I think, seriously than other factors. And so this is just a hypothetical statement, but what if many of these Gulf powers, for example, begin to reduce some of their budgets for vote buying and influencing in places like Somalia? So those are, I think, factors that would be also important to watch, the geopolitical dimensions of these political contestations in many parts. I do share Mike's assessment about Sudan. My only, I think, concern is that the economic situation is very dire, and actually it is not ultimately a political crisis that will probably bring down PM Hamdok's government, but actually
I'm sorry to cut you,
economic
Mr. Rashid,
situation.
can you please conclude it? We don't have that much time on. There is a number of questions that we wanted to answer before we finish here today.
Yeah, so there could be potential for serious instability in Sudan, largely from economic collapse or economic crisis, but also the tensions are also building up. Islamist parties are beginning to organize, and I think could potentially undermine the current government. In the context of Somalia, there is a possibility that there will be an elite pact, and the parties would, and the various stakeholders will come together around a sort of a model that would be sort of workable, I think. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashid. I think there's some technical issue with the text inside of our chat today. I would like to thank the number of people. There's a lot of people actually following us as participants here, and there are many more following us on Facebook. I can see there is a number of questions that have been asked by our followers today and participants. And some of these questions are actually addressed to some of you individually, and others are general questions. I am going to read all the questions and mention the ones that are actually addressed to a specific speaker or panelist. you take them down, please, and then I will leave you. I will select the person going first to answer those questions. The first question is from Hussein Mohammed. Hussein wants to ask a question, Professor Michael, and his question goes, don't you think the COVID-19 justification for the postponement of the election in Ethiopia is a blessing in disguise for the Prosperity Party to prepare itself for the elections at any time after COVID, for the reason that all the opposition parties in Ethiopia are all ethnic-based parties who have no presence to say it acceptable other than their specific ethnic groups. So that's how the question reads. I hope that you got it, Professor Michael. The second question that I have here is from Guled Gele he's asking it from Facebook. Guled asked a general question that is open for everybody to answer, and it reads, as one of the most democratic nations in the Horn of Africa, how can Somaliland capitalize on its democratic process in order to gain preferential treatment from the West? I hope you noted that question down as well. The other question we have here is from Mustafa Ahmed, and Mustafa is asking Professor Michael, I beg your pardon, what the possibility of political instability in Ethiopia what is the possibility of political instability in Ethiopia since elections are postponed? That question was for Michael. Twitter question, it's from Dr. Belganami from Algeria. This doctor is asking, as countries face the consequences of the pandemic, policymakers are looking for effective and balanced solutions to meet both public health challenges and the need to economic recovery. What are the approaches? That's from Dr. Balganami from Algeria, and it's an open question, general question for everybody. We have a question for Rashid Abdi from Yassin Ahmed, and this question is reads, what are the serious economic crises Ethiopia is facing currently? I have another question from Amina. I'm not sure where Amina is asking the question from. Amina asked, it was hard for African leaders to hold free and democratic elections, and now COVID. So what will be the way forward to sustain democracy? So these are the questions, but I would love to start with Professor Michael, and the first question that's been asked by Hussein Mohammed, please.
Okay, thank you. It's a great list of questions. So on this first query that was raised, sort of the benefits of COVID-19 and the postponement to the ruling party in Ethiopia. I mean, I think I should clarify up front that COVID-19, of course, creates certain challenges for any incumbent, right? I mean, so the government has to manage the very real economic fallout from the pandemic, and of course, the economic circumstances of Ethiopia were not easy even before COVID-19. And that can have some real political ramifications. And then, of course, there's the overall government's response to the pandemic, sometimes limits on economic activity, quarantines, these kinds of restrictions, and can create some public anger and some political blowback. So there are risks there. I think the postponement, though, on the narrow issue of the postponement, I think it has worked to the ruling party's advantage. I think, as I mentioned earlier, initially it led to a basic freeze on protest activity and the ability of the opposition to mobilize its supporters. Of course, that's out the window now, as we see from recent days. But I think the other advantage here that's quite clear cut is the election timetable, that the government effectively has the ability to set the election timetable. And when elections happen matters, right? If you can set when the election actually occurs, that can be that can be a political resource that can be used for the groups or interests that are setting the election, setting when the election will be. So I think it has worked to the government's advantage in that sense. So it is a bit of a mixed bag. I think we have to be clear about that.
I'm on mute, sorry. Professor Michael, if you want to continue answering the second question, which has been asked by Mustafa Ahmed, do you have it, or do you want me to?
Yes, no, I do. I wasn't sure if I should continue or give others an opportunity to respond to questions. So I think the second question directly posed to me was, to what extent will the postponement further destabilize Ethiopia? I mean, I think Ethiopia, as I argued, I think Ethiopia in some ways has already been destabilized by the postponement. I'm not suggesting that the postponement wasn't deserved or that it wasn't necessary, but rather the way in which it played out and was handled, I think, has created some real political challenges and problems that are playing out now. And we, I think, are running the risk, Ethiopia, I think, is running the risk of escalating violence, particularly along ethnic lines. Again, I think the last 2 weeks really illustrates this. And I think, as I follow the discourse and conversation about sort of Ethiopian politics and democratization in Ethiopia, you see that things are kind of veering into a debate about, security and public safety on the one hand versus a democracy and political pluralism on the other. And I think once that the debate is framed in that way, it's not good for the sort of the democratic cause or the cause of democratization, and that really is the risk, I think, of escalating violence at this juncture. We could look at democratic transitions around the world. I mean, in general terms, if you have a context of escalating violence, that is not auspicious circumstances for sustainable democratization. So that's I think a real concern.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Professor. The question that I want to ask generally is the question asked by Gule from Facebook. He's following us from Facebook. Thank you, Gule. And I want to start with Professor Nick Chisman, please. Do you have that question, or do you want me to read it again for you, please?
Could you read it out, please? Sorry, thanks.
Sure. The question from Guled asked is, as one of the most democratic nations in the Horn of Africa, how can Somaliland capitalize on its democratic process in order to gain preferential treatment from the West?
I mean, I think to a little extent that some of that's already happened, right? I mean, Somaliland is seen as an entity which has operated elections more effectively than other countries, although, of course, with a lot of controversy in more recent periods as well. And I think that has given it significant credit around the world. Obviously, the issue of recognition and international recognition is still a live one, and maintaining that high quality of democratic aspiration is going to be very significant in terms of pursuing that campaign going forwards. But I think it has made a difference. When you talk to people who engage with Somaliland in international policy circles, they are aware of that reputation and the idea that Somaliland has held the best quality elections in the Horn, and that does play into their perceptions. But of course, those issues around democracy, as we know, when it comes to international relations, have never been the ones that have always driven international actors. International actors are driven by a bunch of different factors, of which that's one, but others are the importance of security, attempts not to destabilize regions, self-interest, and so on. And it will only be one ingredient, I think, amongst all of those. I just wanted to respond very briefly to a couple of the other points that have been made, and then I'll hand over to the other panelists. I think the Ethiopian example is a really good example of a point I wanted to make earlier, but I was running out of time, so I cut it short a little, which is that actually, not holding an election can be as destabilizing as holding an election. And we always think about elections as being potentially destabilizing because they're high stakes events. We can see winner-takes-all politics, we can see controversy, and then of course we could potentially see post-election violence. But not holding elections and losing legitimacy from that, having opposition parties becoming disgruntled, having people believe that you've lost your mandate to govern, can also be destabilizing. I think that's one of the things we're seeing right now in Ethiopia. And I think that's one of the things that leaders need to take into their calculations. Postponing elections might itself be a driver of instability and further problems for governments. So it's really important to see that as a significant factor that also needs to be weighted in. And going back to the really interesting points that were made at the beginning by the discussers, which I think are really good. One of the things you were talking about, Philomena, was, will we see an opportunity to do sort of make new innovations through COVID? Will we see greater digitization? Will we see new forms of campaigns? And I think there is an exciting opportunity there. But I think we also need to be, realistic and sanguine about the extent to which digital processes can solve things. For example, moving to digital election processes such as digital voting will take a couple of years in terms of the procurement process, the design of the equipment, the introduction of that equipment. There are some countries that could probably do that fairly well, but there are other countries where we might really worry about the infrastructure and the ability to do that in a way with the security that would be needed to actually have that for voting. Keeping in mind that we know that there's been hacking attempts on voting machines in the United States. I think we have to be really careful about bringing in new technology as a solution to these problems when the new technology itself might be something that can be manipulated and subverted. So I think one of the things that's really interesting here for me is that COVID-19 presents us with new challenges that demand exciting, innovative responses. But some of those responses could potentially introduce new problems. So I've heard people talking about, for example, could we introduce postal voting so voters can vote from home? Can we introduce electronic voting because people have mobile phones? But one thing that's true of both of those processes is that they're often quite centralized and opaque and hard for domestic observers and international observers to actually get inside the black box and see what's going on. And because of that, there's often manipulation or accusations of manipulation of those processes. So I think it's really important that in our kind of rush to respond in new and innovative ways, we don't risk bringing in new systems that actually might cause more problems than they resolve. So it's important to be innovative, but also perhaps to have one eye on the way that some of these processes are played out and to be cautious about how they might work and whether or not they would really be something like a silver bullet. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would like to bring Philomena to actually respond to the... Sorry, do you want to say something?
So, no, I just want to interrupt 1 second, one for technical communication to the people who are following us. And second, because being apart from you as a moderator, the only Somalilander who is in the list, probably a word to say about this question will be the case. So if you allow me, one of the technical aspect is that we have a lot of questions and we are following you from Facebook and also here from within Zoom. So we are anticipating it will be difficult really to answer all your questions, but please continue because of, as Professor Nick was saying also in the chat, we will continue this conversation on Twitter and also other social media. So please ask questions and we will do our best to answer to the questions and then but follow up with you in the social media. The second thing is that I want to underline this issue about Somaliland. I want to tell our audience that we will be having a session dedicated on Somaliland elections, democratic process, and not only an impact on coronavirus. Because of it is timely, as you know, just a couple of days, Somaliland again, they put again on track that the election is by the end of the year. And then there was an agreement between political parties and we will see what's coming up. We want to follow closely and see how this is a reliable time frame to do. So it is a timely discussion in Somaliland where we are interested to share with you what's going on. This session will be coming on the Saturday list where we will speak in Somali. So it will be voiced and mainly targeted for Somalilanders to contribute to understand what is going on in Somaliland, how this is a timely discussion mainly on elections. One last point that I want to underline is that, of course, politics overlap a sort of man-made corruption of moralities when it comes to the putting the end of the responsibility of governing of course, at the end of the term. So it's an excuse that remains to become really valid nowadays, that everyone looks for postponement of elections. For that reason, we were focusing. But I was also interested to see how someone probably can take advantage, probably doing elections in this time, or doing something so fundamental in constitutional wise during the lockdown, because of that it might be advantage. And the case I want to mention is a Zimbabwe case that it's on the news, that has been a constitutional amendment while Zimbabweans are on lockdown. What is happening? I don't know. I can't say anything because I am not expert in the area, but it's a legitimate question to ask if it's the case now in this crisis, in this lockdown, touch up something about in the constitution, including also, of course, the elections. So that's just a contribution and adding one point in the discussion to the valuable that has been raised. And one last thing, there are so many questions already passed to the answered section. So I invite Selma also to look at that, because it's really that already passed in the answered session. Thank you, Selma. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chama. As I was saying, I would like to bring in Philomena. There are a number of questions asked, and I'm sure, Philomena, you want to comment on what's been discussed here. So
okay.
Please.
Thank you so much, Selma. So firstly, I will, yes, thank you so much, Professor Nick, for clarifying that, of course, new technology is always a good thing, but we should also be wary about it being used for the wrong reasons. And of course, when we speak about technologies in Africa, we need to also confront the issue of lack of connectivity for everybody, as well as even basic electricity to be able to use some of these digital technologies, because that's still a real problem for a lot of communities in Africa. I wanted to answer two of the questions that were posed by the participants. The first one being, how can Somaliland make itself more favorable or to the West? And apart from the points mentioned by Professor Nick and Professor Mike, I would also add definitely an inclusive democratic process, because as you know from examples where this has happened in Africa, I will choose, for example, Rwanda, which has one of the highest representation of women in its parliament. And through this, it's also seen empowerment of the youth as a group in democratic processes. They're involved in participation in decision making, and this has placed the country quite favorably amongst the West, and also a lot of innovation as well, which is being promoted in the country at the moment. And then on the question of what processes can governments use to effectively meet both public health and economic recovery? Of course, with the COVID pandemic, a lot of countries had to prioritize the public health situation, as you saw, not just domestically, but also regional cooperation amongst the different regional economic communities, but also with the AU stepping in to help countries. And now, as we move towards a medium and of course long-term phase, and we have to think realistically about economic recovery. And I think this is where a lot of countries now have to realistically see what they need to do, given that COVID-19, of course, exposed the need for African countries to be more self-reliant going forward. And I think a lot of countries are now having to revisit their, for example, industrial policies to see how to have value chain development, more domestic production. But of course, we need to also look at what's happening on the continent with the Continental Free Trade Area, which is being seen as a game changer towards Africa, and also enabling, for example, regional value development, but also industrialization and more intra-African trade. So I think a lot of countries are already on this bandwagon, and we're just hopeful that they will have the negotiations concluded to actually start trading next year as it was postponed. But of course, to also be realistic, we still have the elephant, so to say, which is the debt issue. And a lot of countries still struggle with having to have debt repayments amidst COVID-19, amidst having to also public health crisis at the same time. So that conversation on debt relief and debt forgiveness per se also has to be had realistically amongst different countries, and of course their financial institutions and donors who will lend the money. So I think these are my 2 points for now, but of course I'm open to contributing some more to other questions that come up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilhelmina. There are a number of questions asked asked by the followers, and I would like to ask them if they can just make the questions short. It's not necessary to have a long comment and then a question at the end. Please make your questions very short so we can read them to the panelists. Another thing I have noticed is that Professor Nick is actually engaged in Zoom chat. Thank you very much. That's a very good move. There was a question asked by one of the followers, I think, on Facebook, and this question was for Rashid Abdi. Rashid, do you want to answer that question, please? And are your comments? Do you want me to read the question again? You're on mute.
Thank you very much. Yes, the question was on Ethiopia's economic situation. I think the situation was extremely bad a year ago, has slightly improved, largely because of various factors. One, of course, is the decision by China to basically restructure some of the repayments by Ethiopia. There was also, I think, several governments which have deposited money into the treasury so as to stabilize the Ethiopian birr. That has sort of eased, I think, some of the immediate economic challenges. But there's no doubt that the economy faces a serious struggle. One has to remember that Ethiopia, for almost 2 decades, was one of the fastest growing economies in the world, double digits, 12%. And that was quite significant. Now, all that has slowed down largely because of, repayments, but also because of instability. There's no direct foreign investment which is coming into the country. Many of the investors have actually closed down their, factories and plantations. So, as long as the country remains unstable and the politics remains, the future remains uncertain, then I think that will be a big challenge for attracting investment. But clearly, this is a huge country with enormous resources, and if it just fixes its politics, there's no doubt that Ethiopia would continue, I think, to enjoy some of those double-digit economic growths we saw a few decades ago. Can I just also comment quickly on Somaliland? Yeah, just one quick comment, which is, Somaliland's democratization is not tied very much to the international community. I mean, I have talked to many people who have been involved in Somaliland's democratization, and they tell me that democratization is its own good. We are doing this for our own sake. We are not doing it to appease the international community. And I think we need to change the mindset. Democracy is its own value, its own good. And so a democratic Somaliland is a stable Somaliland, and it isn't very much tied to the recognition. I think it is a mistake to tie democratization of Somaliland to recognition. I think that is a big mistake. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rashid, I would like to follow up with another question that's been asked by Mustafa Ahmed. The question reads, is there an alternative way of looking into elections credibility with the absence of international observers so that we can localize electoral management? And I think this is a question that is open, can be open for everybody else to chip in.
Yeah, I think Nick is more competent in that area. It's a much more technical area of election, election and electoral politics. My own one bit, my own few sentences is that countries where you have strong civil society, in particular, like Somaliland, for example, also Kenya, you have very strong civil society, and every electoral cycle they organize themselves, and they have hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 of electoral observers, and some of them actually do some brilliant work. they go to every part of the country where, foreign observers cannot go. And so, I think going forward, it is important to invest in these local electoral monitoring systems to strengthen the hand of civil society. But I think Nick is better placed to respond to that.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really great question. Obviously, we've just had an election in Malawi that was seen as being very legitimate and had no international observation. There were no international observers on the ground. There were some attempts to do kind of virtual observation in collaboration with domestic groups. There were a small number of international staff on the ground, but there wasn't a proper international observation effort. So we've seen that good quality elections clearly can be held in the absence of observers. I think one of the things, obviously, you then want to see is very strong domestic civil society mobilization so that you get strong presence of people in polling stations. The journalists and newspapers can play a significant role by, again, making sure that there's strong presence in polling stations. And if domestic groups and media groups do a really good job, you can hold the government accountable and make sure that you get a good sense of what the results were going to be. It's a big logistical effort. It's very difficult, but it's not impossible. And thinking about, COVID-19 as a kind of opportunity as well as a crisis, wouldn't it be great if we ended the COVID-19 era with actually renewed confidence in domestic observation groups and the ability of domestic civil society groups to solve some of these problems for themselves, and a reduced reliance on the role of international observers having to come in and monitor the process. In some ways that might be a really good thing, and we might be able to use this period as a way of showing the great work that domestic observers can do. But obviously that's a lot of pressure, and it will require greater investment in those domestic organizations and to some extent additional expertise and training. So I think one of the things that I'd really like to see is more effective coordination between international groups and domestic groups, especially when international groups can't travel, a transfer of funds from the international to the domestic, and then really strengthening civil society groups to basically be able to do it for themselves. And if so, I think we can hopefully have more elections that are good quality, but don't necessarily have to have international election observers present.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. There was a question actually for Mike, and I think it's maybe very important for Mike to answer this. Let me find it. The question is from Rashid Noor, and he wants to know what's the likelihood violence due to lack of settlement between stakeholders in Ethiopia due to the delay of the elections. So that question is for Professor Michael.
Yeah, and I think I'd spoken to this issue a bit earlier. I mean, I think there already is quite a significant degree of violence, and it could escalate further in a couple of different areas, whether it's the federal, we've seen violence, of course, in Oromia over the last few weeks, violence between Amhara and Tigray Khalil, violence between the federal government and Tigray. I mean, all of those things, I think, are on the table. And as I said before, not good for the long-term democratization process. I mean, Ethiopia may stabilize, but in terms of democracy, that's the real question. Violence and democracy really don't go together. And so I think that's the concern. And my hope is that Ethiopia is able to pull back from the brink, that some of the key political forces are able to reconcile and develop a roadmap going towards the next elections. That's the real hope.
Okay, great, thank you. I mean, there's a lot of questions actually, but we are running out of time, unfortunately. We want to conclude, comments or the points that our panelists want to make. Is there any other info? No, I'm going to stop there, the questions. But obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic of the COVID-19 is affecting the democratization process in Africa. And we have extensively discussed about the postponement of elections. I personally would like to know the prospect of democratization in Africa, in the post-COVID-19. That question and any other comments, final comments that you would like to make, I would love to start with Philomena, please.
Sorry, I lost you for a while. My internet went funny. Could you just repeat the question?
My question, actually, my personal question to you guys was the prospect of democratization process in Africa in the post-COVID-19, and any other comment that you would like to make, final comments that you would like to make regarding our discussion here today.
Thank you for the floor. Because the points made by my fellow panelists have stuck with me, but I think for me, what I want to, of course, make very clear is that even if we have the option to have election postponement, this should not solely be something that is done by the executive power. There should be a consultation process with all the other stakeholders in the country, be it parliamentarians, but also ordinary citizens have to be involved. This way we avoid, as Professor Nick was saying, the likelihood of political unrest by the opposition, also by civil unrest, because the decision was something that was sort of like forced on them, not something that they were actually participating in. And then, of course, like I said, just to come back to how can we strengthen, regional and African Union responses to some of these situations, because this is ongoing on the continent, but of course we need a very clear position from the African Union when it comes to what people call constitutional coups, because a lot of countries have already seen in the past an amendment to the constitution, and there's a likelihood, as some people have already expressed, of this pandemic being used by some of the leaders to also amend constitutions that are not in line with the way power should be taken over in a country. So just to be clear about that, is that we require some sort of coordinated approach from the African Union towards addressing this issue, which I think has been something that hasn't been done in a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Due to the shortage of time, I want to give 2 minutes to each of you, and please start with, again, Rashid Abdi, please. I have
Thank you very much.
I have tears on my back, and I think we have overstepped our time limit. So please go ahead.
No, I think the prospects for democratization in the Horn cannot be, I think, simplified. There are countries definitely where there is potential and prospects seem in the long term good, and I will put in that category country like Sudan, where you have a very strong civil society, very strong political parties, a history of actually protest and very organized, disciplined protest. That, I think, is a country where democracy in the longer term has potential. For countries like Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, I think the long-term prospects could be good, but I think in the short to medium term, you will have situations where I think you will have electoral crisis and then elite pacts, which tend to stabilize. So, it isn't a very optimistic scenario for democratization, but these countries will muddle through these kind of elite pacts. But as I said, Sudan is a country that shows a lot of promise if only it can overcome its biggest challenge, which is economic decline and serious economic crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Michael, last comment, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have any cogent conclusion to make. I mean, I think the Horn region, when it comes to democratization, is going through a tough time. I mean, I think the optimism and the euphoria of 2018 and 2019 has now dissipated, and we're faced with a lot of hard realism about how difficult it is to do democratic institution building in this region. As I said before, in many ways, beyond Kenya, perhaps Somaliland, we're building from the ground up. I mean, Ethiopia has no real history of democratic politics. Certainly Sudan does, although democratic processes were repeatedly interrupted by the military and security apparatus throughout history. But I just want to sort of end on a hopeful note, and I think despite the fact that the region is going through some challenges, I think there is time and there is an opportunity in both Ethiopia and Sudan to reset, to recalibrate, and for the elites to make the kind of elite pact that is necessary to stabilizing their particular countries and advancing the democratic cause. But it's going to take a lot of work. So I don't think the situation, I don't want to leave people, I don't want people that are viewing this discussion to leave despondent. I think there is some hope for the future. And of course, if you take the case of Ethiopia and the political environment in Ethiopia with all its challenges, political space has been liberalized. If we take the issue, for instance, of the postponement of the election, with all the deficiencies of that process, there was incredibly robust debate within Ethiopian civil society among scholars about the Ethiopian constitution, what it meant, how to postpone the election in a way that was consistent with the constitution. It was really quite a remarkable debate. And it's things like that, I think, that bode well to the future. And those are the kind of rays of hope that we should look for.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Nick, do you want to add something to that?
Just very quickly, I think it's important, that we're not going to, it's important to say that we're not going to see one trajectory, right? We often talk about Africa, but in reality, there are 4 or 5 different Africas where democracy is concerned. And we see some countries like Ghana that seem to be consolidating with transfers of power and stronger trust and sort of democracy maturing. And we see other countries like Tanzania, where perhaps democracy is moving backwards for the moment, and other countries, perhaps like Cameroon, where democracy never really got started. So I think one thing we just need to keep in mind is it's not just going to be one trajectory. And my prediction for the next few years would be that actually one of the things we're going to see is some of those democratic countries are going to become more democratic and start to look even more consolidated and stable. Some of those authoritarian states are going to stay basically where they are, heavily authoritarian states that hold elections but without any of the trappings of democracy. And the distance between the two is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So I actually don't see a kind of convergence on a common ground in Africa. I actually see different types of countries diverging. And I think in 5-6 years' time, we could be talking about really big variations in the quality of democracy. And I think that has really big implications, right? Because, how do you come to an agreement at the African Union when you've got a certain number of really democratic states and a certain number of really authoritarian states? Those tensions, I think, aren't going to be resolved anytime soon.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us today. Thanks to our followers as well. This has been a very interesting and fruitful discussion, and our panelists are quite honestly, giving everything. Thank you very much. I appreciate the session, and I appreciate the work that the Hargeisa Cultural Center is doing, Chama and his team. And I would leave to Chama, Dr. Chama, to actually conclude this session tonight. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Selma. And I think I share the same sentiment of coming from the comments of our flow. Is to thank the entire team, the panelists, the respondents, of course, the moderator, and most importantly, the value, time, and tangible contributions that you put in this timely discussion. I also thank the wonderful audience and who allowed us today to have the full house of the event, but also the flowers from the social media, whose contributions via Q&A session was really amazing. And I again apologize that we couldn't cover all the answers, but we definitely continue flowing up with Twitter and other social media, and then we will post the video on YouTube as usual. I want to thank both Professor Nick, Rashid, and Philomena, but also I really want to salute and congratulate with my friend Michael. As Tirst was saying, has been just nominated as the next director of the African Studies Center in Boston. It's honestly well-deserved recognition. We are proud of you on this representation.
Thank you.
Really. And I expected several times to have Michael here in Hargeisa for Hargeisa International Book Fair. It didn't work, but I'm happy that finally, even though it's virtual, you have a way to talk to our audience so it's really, really a pleasure to have you. All of you. So it's a great honor. Rashid was a part of the cultural center in one way or other whenever he traveled to Somaliland. So it's a pleasure to have you. And I hope to have Nick as well in Somaliland when post-COVID session opens the doors to travel again. One last word. I really want to thank the Hargeisa Cultural Center team, my team, for this a series of webinars that's becoming popular, and this is a way to say that the coronavirus has not come all in negative, because of this started because of we couldn't continue doing the events that we were doing physically at the cultural center, and we started the webinars, and then we are reaching really huge number of audience, which makes us happy, and we will continue. So thank you. For the next Wednesday, we will be having another wonderful session. Tirsit will write an email immediately after this session. So thank you for the real contribution. Thank you, Selma, for the wonderful work that you have done.
Thank you so much to the Hargeisa Center and to all the panelists, and have a lovely evening on my side.
Bye-bye.